On my channel, I've featured videos around the Speedmaster a couple of times in recent months, looking in detail at the development of the Moonswatch and looking at homages with the Pagani PD1701. Those experiences convinced me that I needed a Speedmaster in my life and on my wrist. I recently consolidated a huge chunk of my watch collection in order to buy myself a Tudor Black Bay 54. What I hadn't banked on was quite how much I'd make back from sales, and so I had just enough to get myself a Speedmaster as well. Obviously not a new one, but enough for me to engage in my favourite pastime, hunting for a bargain watch. What you might not immediately know about the Speedmaster is there are actually a lot of different variations. Not all Speedmasters are the famous Moonwatch, not all of them have 3 subdials, not all have black dials, and some are so exquisite and expensive that they boggle the mind. When we talk about the Moonwatch, really we're talking about the Speedmaster Professional range. But for me, that comes with 2 issues. Number 1, I couldn't afford it. Even if I skipped out on the Black Bay, I couldn't have afforded it. And number 2, perhaps even more pressing than my first issue, it's too big for me. At 42mm, it's outside of my comfortable range of 36 to 40mm, and if I've learned anything on my horological journey, it's that dimensions are king. Thankfully, given the age of the range, I'm certainly not the first person to run into that issue, and Omega have thought about their smaller wristed customers. In 1988, a year after I was born, they released the rather unfortunately named Speedmaster Reduced, which comes with a diameter of 39mm. While the naming was framed around the reduction in size, the specifications were also completely different from the professional range. This was seen as a more affordable baby brother to the real deal. Perhaps the biggest difference beyond the sizing is the movement. The Reduced features an ETA 292A2 base fitted with a Dubois de Pras 2020 chronograph module. Effectively, one part of the movement is stacked on top of the other, and that has an impact on the aesthetics of the watch. You will notice 2 key design differences as a result of this movement. The pushers do not line up with the crown, and the subdials are pushed further towards the edges of the dial. Now, perfectionists may well deride these issues. Certainly, the alignment of the pushers does look out of place, but I would ask how often you look at a watch from the kind of angles that actually reveal this issue. I do think the placement of the subdials isn't as well balanced as the professional model either. However, I think these are fair trade-offs for the benefits of this watch. The smaller wearing size, the fact the watch is automatic, and of course the considerably more affordable price point. Models produced between 1988 and 2005 have Hesalite crystals rather than sapphire, and while models did get the upgraded sapphire from that point onwards, Omega stopped producing the reduced models altogether in 2009. Again, not exactly ideal, but a compromise I'm willing to accept. I have a few other models in the collection that need some polywatch every now and again, and in the grand scheme of things, I just see it as part and parcel of vintage watch ownership. I don't want to spend the whole video focusing on what people might perceive as the downsides of this model, because it isn't a fair comparison to make. This watch cost me just under $2,000, which is almost $2,000 less than the very cheapest Moonwatch professional model you could buy second hand at the time of producing this video. And as the majority of the cheapest models are from Japan, that doesn't include the cost of import tax and delivery, not to mention the horrendous wear and tear that most have clearly seen. Not only that, but given the size of the professional model, I wouldn't want it anyway. To get something in the size bracket that I would want, the RRP of the 321 models, which are still larger at 39.7mm, comes in a cool $18,000, which is totally out of the question. So while I can see why the Reduced might not be for everyone, to me it's some incredible value for almost exactly what I wanted. Perhaps the biggest surprise for me with the Reduced was the quality of the bracelet. Now, as I mentioned, this is obviously a vintage model, and while it is in really good condition, there are signs of wear and tear, especially on the bracelet. The telltale scratches on the clasp tell me that this has been worn a lot by someone slaving over a keyboard in an office. However, just like my Datejust, there is a little bit more give in the bracelet because of that love it's seen in a past life, which makes it more comfortable to wear on wrist than most modern watch bracelets that have no give to them. Not only that, but when I was hunting for a Speedmaster, the bracelet was honestly not even part of my thought process, beyond the desire to have one on a bracelet rather than a leather strap. I really hadn't considered it at all. I was surprised then when it came to be one of my favourite features. Those thin, polished connecting links are just so well done and give the bracelet a little extra flavour to it that elevates it above a standard 3-link construction. Although this isn't really close to the version that went to the moon, this is still a part of that heritage, and I would be lying, as I think anyone would, if I said that the enduring spirit of human exploration that this embodies wasn't at least a part of the selling point for owning a Speedmaster. I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, as it's a topic I've spoken about at length in my retrospective, but what I'll add is that Omega are certainly not shy about advertising the link to the moon and space exploration, so I don't see any reason to avoid it as a reason for wanting to own a similar model. While there are other watches out there that have some claims to fame when it comes to space travel, the Belova Lunar Pilot and the Seiko Pogue are the first two that spring to mind, really the Speedmaster is the watch most associated with it. This next point is really quite meta when it comes to watch collecting, and I've tried to get my thoughts across as concisely as I can. Let me know in the comments if you've thought along these lines before. Now that I've built up my collection with a few pieces I've really had to save for and spent a lot of time with cheaper homages, I can start to understand the real differences between the two. For me, the most noticeable thing is not having to compromise as much. In part, I think that comes down to two elements at play. Firstly, more expensive watches tend to be more refined. It's the smaller details that you might not even notice unless you're a collector. That could be the movement being a little bit more accurate, the dimensions a little tighter, the finishing a little better, or the wearing experience slightly more comfortable. Secondly, when more money is involved, I find that I'm a lot pickier to begin with and far more aware of where I should and should not be willing to compromise. Now, I've already stated that I've made a few trade-offs here with the Speedmaster Reduced, so that might seem like an odd point to make, and it's true, aesthetically there are a few tiny details that could be stronger. That's where it's important to get to grips with what you really value in a watch, and the answer will be different for different people. For me, I've said many times on the channel and indeed in this video, dimensions are absolutely critical. If a watch is 36 to 40mm in diameter and between 8 and 12mm thick, I know that I'm far more likely to enjoy the wearing experience than if it's 42mm in diameter and 15mm thick. I don't want to come across like I'm utterly captivated by brand power, but yes, it does also matter to me what it says on the dial. During what I see as my horological journey, I get much better at working out what does and does not work for me. So when I invest a more significant sum than usual, I do so with far more certainty that I'm going to be happier with the addition to my collection. With those thoughts in mind, some areas that I am happy to compromise on, which are maybe going to be slightly controversial, is whether or not the watch is new, whether or not it has papers, and indeed the original box. Now, obviously I do care about the condition and whether or not the watch is authentic. I'm not for a second saying that I'd be happy to buy a broken watch from an untrustworthy source. However, eBay run their own third-party verification system, which certifies the authenticity of a watch before it's shipped to you at no extra cost. And if you're buying at the lowest end of the vintage watch market as I am, you're not going to find box and papers for very many watches. But that is taken into account with the price you're paying. So if you're worried about resale value, really it isn't going to make that much of a difference for that specific kind of purchase or sale. I realise that this video has been sidetracked a lot by me talking through my thought processes when buying vintage, and in part that makes a lot of sense, because every vintage watch is going to be different. Even if you go and buy yourself a Speedmaster Reduced right after this video, it isn't necessarily going to be the same condition or indeed reference as mine, and equally it's going to have lived a completely different life. Having said that, I do want to spend a little bit more time thinking about the watch itself. The version you're seeing here has a further oddity in that it has Arabic numerals on the minute track, a feature you won't find on the later reduced models or indeed the Moonwatch itself. The last separating feature with the full-size model is that it has a longer lug-to-lug width of 20mm compared to the 18mm for the reduced. If you want to branch out further, there are actually other colourways available for the reduced models, though they are rarer and harder to find. There are two-tone versions, an albino dial, a JDM exclusive blue dial variant, and some models made from solid gold. I'm not exactly a fan of buying watches as commodities to sell, but from a value perspective, it is worth noting that the value of all the reduced variants has increased by a fair amount in recent years. In part that's because of the price bubble that many luxury watches experienced during COVID, but also I think that some of that increased value has to be attributed to the popularity of the Moonswatch range. I'll just finish with what is the most important factor to me when it comes to these keep or sell videos, and that is wrist time. I've had this watch for around 3 months at this point, and it's been fighting with the Black Bay 54 for wrist time the whole way through. That is a really positive sign for me. While it might not be the #1 go-to for everyday wear, it doesn't just sit in a box either. Now, with that said, I don't think it will come as a huge surprise to say that this is going to be a keeper in my collection. At the absolute minimum, it stops me ever buying another Speedmaster homage, but at most, I think it elevates my collection to another level. It's a timeless piece that has a pretty strong argument for being the quintessential chronograph. There will be some who would say that that only applies to the professional models, but if you're going to go down that line of argument, it isn't as if the pro models that the regular public can buy have actually been to the moon either, so I think it's a little bit of a moot point. As ever, thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, consider dropping the video a like and subscribing for more content like this.